Hi, my name is Paris, and I am a counselor and adventure therapist in training. I'm also an herbalist and a gardener and a forager. And I'm going to chat with you today about what is transformative justice and what is restorative justice, what are the differences between those two things, and what it might look like for me as a counselor to implement transformative justice into my future work with clients. And I'm also going to identify a couple of resources in the Boulder County area that offer restorative justice practices. So I'm new to the idea of transformative justice as it applies to humans and human communities. However, as an herbalist and somebody who works with the earth, I understand it to be a systems lens of looking at the root causes of harm and what are the conditions that enabled this harm or this violence to occur. And when we're looking at that in terms of people and human communities, we're also looking at how do we respond to this harm or to this violence or to this situation in a way that won't perpetuate harm, that won't cause more harm, and that won't cause more trauma, potentially. And it's also looking at how do we cultivate things that prevent harm from happening in the first place. It's also asking questions around how do we collude with harm? How are we holding a part or a piece in the unfolding of this harmful situation to happen? And a lot of this I learned from a video that is amazing. It's linked below. If you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do so. It's about 10 minutes talking about what transformative justice is. On the other hand, restorative justice involves harm doers, victims, and the community, and it's really focused around preventing a situation that involves harm from entering the criminal justice system. And so it's identifying restorative solutions that are going to use justice while also not involving punitive action. And so usually it's involving the harm doers, the victims, and the community identifying a solution together. It often usually involves apologies and creating some sort of agreement on like what is going to make everyone feel better while instilling this sense of having done wrong on part of the harm doer. And so the major difference between that to me is, I'll use an example. In reading about restorative justice, it often involves, it's like an adjunctive or auxiliary thing to the criminal justice system, or an alternative to jail time or to more punitive actions. And one example is that they'll have the harm doer make a public apology, and they might have to apologize in front of their community members as well as in front of the victims. And while that may be really helpful and it might prevent people from entering the criminal justice system, I also see that as a potentially really triggering or re-traumatizing thing for the harm doer, for the person who caused harm in the first place, if they have a history of trauma, because it might activate shame for them. And so transformative justice, on the other hand, I think is very relationship-centered, and I think that it would involve identifying the root causes for that individual and that community that allowed that harm to be caused in the first place, and it would avoid activating shame for anybody involved. And it might look at working on trauma resolution or building pieces around the desire to change, the desire to be held accountable, communication, and things that are going to give somebody the tools and the building blocks to be able to address the things within themselves and within their community that contributed to the harm, or within our culture. And so some limitations that I might encounter as a counselor in being able to practice transformative justice is that as somebody who will have their license in the future, I may have an obligation to report to a court or to the criminal justice system if I have a client who committed an act of violence or was involved in a crime, I might have to share aspects of my counseling notes that would otherwise be confidential, which could limit my ability to really be an ally or be someone that can hold the harm doer accountable in their life. I also might have limits in my availability to people who want to be engaged in a long-term transformative process, just from being able to accept insurance or just the many barriers that people might experience in being able to access care to a counselor and to having a long-term relationship with a counselor. However, there are a lot of things that I can do, that we can do as counselors. A huge one for implementing transformative justice with our clients. A huge one is going to be identifying the root causes of harm. So we can look at things like adverse childhood experiences. We can look at attachment wounds that came from earlier in life. We can look at potential traumas that they've experienced. We can look at cultural and systemic factors that contribute to harm, and address those things with our clients. A huge thing that we do as counselors is we're always looking to establish a therapeutic relationship with our clients. We are looking to align ourselves with that person as a person and meet them where they're at. And that to me is like foundational to the process of transformation into transformative justice, is to feel like, you know, someone cares about you and they're really invested in your healing, even if you feel shame around something that you did. Another thing that we can do as counselors is use motivational interviewing in the stages of change model to identify where someone's at in their change process and help them identify their own reasons for wanting to engage in change. And so something that comes up around transformative justice is that the harm doer needs to want to be held accountable. They need to want to be involved in this process of change for themselves. And maybe when they first enter into the counseling relationship, they don't want to be there. Maybe they got referred through the court system and it's a restorative justice program, or maybe their community is asking you to intervene and to be a part of the process for them. But you can use something like motivational interviewing and stages of change to say, okay, you're in pre-contemplation, you're not even really thinking about making changes, but you can still help them to be engaged in a process of identifying their own reasons for being there, outside of people leveraging and asking them to be there. You can also start to identify and implement interventions that are based on trauma resolution or that are based on healing attachment wounds. You can identify resources for your client, like who are friends or family or peers that they have outside of the counseling relationship who are invested in their process, who can help hold them accountable. Is there a group that you could form around people who have had similar experiences with harm or with trauma, that are involved in similar situations, that can support each other and witness each other? So there's a lot of things that we can do. And then another one would be if you are having clients referred to you through a restorative justice program. So if there's a court program and they have a restorative justice aspect to their work, and they send you a harm doer to work with them, you can implement transformative justice work into a restorative justice program. So you can really look to identify the root causes of harm, really look to work with that client in changing the conditions in their life or in their community that they identify as contributing to why they caused harm. And then they could implement that into the restorative justice program and maybe come up with some interventions or some ways to make amends, essentially, that are based on their desires for transformation. And so a couple of resources in the Boulder County community that are offering restorative justice. There's a volunteer program with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office that I'll link below, that's mostly working with juveniles and keeping kids out of the juvenile court system. And then there's the Longmont Community Justice Partnership that is also doing similar work. So Those are also linked below. I encourage you to check them out. Please watch the video on Transformative Justice, and thanks so much for listening.